It's a broad and open question. Before we get into skills, let me just talk about sort of attributes to be cultivated. It's difficult because there's this question that we grapple with a lot in the U.S. in a lot of the entrepreneurship programs that we work with youth in the U.S. around, can this be taught, or are these attributes that you just find in people and sort of help to cultivate? And I often bounce between the two schools of thought periodically, but the most essential aspect in my experience working with all these startups that any successful entrepreneur has to have is just an unbelievable level of persistence. And it's difficult because you're going to encounter a tremendous number of obstacles. Building a startup in New York or San Francisco or Washington, D.C., even more so if you're building it in a place that doesn't have kind of all those resources immediately available to you, you're going to encounter just a tremendous number of barriers and obstacles and rejection and failure on your path to eventual success, and you may not eventually succeed. The only chance you have to eventually be successful is just being incredibly stubborn and incredibly persistent about pushing through these barriers. And for me, it was I sort of almost describe it like developing a muscle, like training. The more barriers you encounter that you're eventually able to break through, the more you know that you can break through barriers, the more persistent you can be the next time, the more you can train and develop that. But it's hard to sort of, it's not just a skill that you can read about and check the box and go, great, I've got persistence. But it is the most essential attribute that I think any entrepreneur needs to have. I joke, there's this idea that is very commonly talked about in American entrepreneurship circles, that we need to celebrate failure. That it's very important to sort of have a culture of risk. That part of what makes America unique is that, hey, you can fail and it's okay, and you can still go on and do your next thing. And that, in other cultures, failure is much more stigmatized. And that's absolutely true. It's also true that almost no successful entrepreneur that I've ever worked with, or when I look in myself, in any remote way likes to fail. In fact, they're massively, viscerally competitive individuals, men or women, who hate to fail more than anything else and will just fight through all this sort of pain to eventually get to success. So it's a tricky question. Another really core attribute that we look for in entrepreneurs, that we invest in, that we work with in our incubator program, is the ability to communicate effectively. In almost every case, whether you're doing something that's very complex and based on a technology and is entrepreneurial, or whether you're doing something on the social entrepreneurship sphere where you see an opportunity to bring people together in a new way, when you're first starting out, you have this idea in your mind that's pretty intuitive to you and is just not intuitive to anybody else. And it's complex and it's difficult, and in order for you to build the sort of coalition of people around you that you need to be successful, whether it's the employees who are going to work for you, or just advisors who are going to make connections for you, or customers or investors or whoever it may be, you're going to have to get really, really good at figuring out how to take all of that kind of complex, not yet formed ideas and tell it in a really simple story. I think those aspects of persistence, being able to communicate very effectively, the sort of ability to solve problems when you don't have all the information available to you. To me, being an entrepreneur often feels like you're, in a dark room feeling your way through a problem, right? If the lights were turned on and everybody could see what the problem was, it'd be easy. What makes it hard, the reason you have such ability to create value as an entrepreneur, is that you kind of are able to feel your way through and figure it out first. Like, those are all the core attributes an entrepreneur needs. In terms of skills, things you can teach, I get more and more boring the longer I've been at this, right? You really do need to understand the basics of kind of economics and accounting. You got to be able to talk about how much money you're making and how much money you're spending and whether you're actually generating a profit or not in a way that sophisticated people can understand. Nowadays you need to understand distribution and digital distribution in an awful lot of cases, whether that's WeChat or Viper or WhatsApp, whether it's Facebook, whether it's email lists, but how are you going to kind of reach your audience, whether it's, depending on where you are in the world, just being really effective at using SMS, but sort of how are you going to engage and reach your audience. Part of what's made it so much easier to be an entrepreneur nowadays is the fact that you can reach people so incredibly effectively and precisely using these digital channels, and yet it astounds me how many entrepreneurs we meet up with that aren't using those channels and aren't using them in a particularly sophisticated way. And then if you want to do so many things nowadays, having a good grounding in technology and engineering, you don't necessarily need to be the engineer, but being familiar with the potential of what technology affords, even if your product isn't technology per se, just being able to use technology to do things more efficiently and do things in a way that scales more rapidly is just incredibly powerful in the modern world. And if you have skills in that area, it's going to be a huge advantage to you.
Great.